Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Embodied Dialogue podcast. My name is Seth Dellinger, and I am thrilled to be talking today with Ari Nielsen. Welcome, Ari.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I'm going to do a little introduction of you, which is definitely going to be incomplete because you've been involved with so many different things, but just to give listeners a sense of it, and then I'll invite you to sort of, add on anything you would like. But I guess the place where I found you is that you're the author of this book called Searchless Responsiveness. And pieces of this book were on Substack, where I found you. The subtitle of the book is On Free Feeling Desire, Unlimited Participation in Life Without Fixed Directionality, which is the ordinary life of trees. So this is a fascinating book, and definitely some stuff in here that we'll want to talk about. But I don't know if you would accept the term that you're a polymath, but you're definitely someone who's delved into all kinds of things. As I mentioned just before we started, I was listening to some piano music that you recorded. Some of the compositions had the title Streaming, which I'm guessing is a reference to Wilhelm Reich's work. But you spent a decade in the community, the spiritual community around Adi Da. You've been involved with many different forms of meditation. This particular, the reason we're talking today was sort of spurred by a post you did on Substack where you mentioned a bunch of different kind of somatic practices that you have been involved in. And I myself am trained in the Feldenkrais Method, which you had mentioned you had experienced, but there were many more. In the end of this book, you sort of give your own miniature autobiography. And one of the things you mentioned was a homeless guy that you spent 3 years hanging out with on a regular basis. And, it was important enough clearly to put it in your biography. But I mentioned that as just a little opening idea for listeners about searchless responsiveness. I think that in addition to the sort of traditions, we could say, that you've been involved with, I get the real sense of just like a experimentalism in life, that you're, curious about just trying out all kinds of things. And then just to mention two more things, which I can make a formal reference. You edited and wrote portions of a 3-volume work called The Myth of Unhappiness. The main author is Bruce DeMarsico, who is the creator of the Option Method, which we might talk about a bit. But this is a very, I think, pretty radical approach to the problem of unhappiness in the world that he put forward. So I found out about this, and I've explored Option. We've already talked about, and I sent you a previous episode of Embodied Dialogue that I did with Wendy Dolber, who is a practitioner. And you're currently involved in the Evolving Ground community, which is a meditation community led by Charlie Aubrey, who wrote this book, Opening Awareness, which I've also read and has impacted my own meditation practice. So there's more to it, but I give people an idea about you. And I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to add as an introduction.
Well, I think the best introduction are whatever anecdotes come out naturally out of conversation. You live a while, things happen. So I'll pull out stories when the moment's right.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go then to what sort of inspired me to reach out for this particular call, which was, as I mentioned, I'm a practitioner of the Feldenkrais Method, and Wilhelm Reich, whose works that you have, sounds like, extensively been involved with, at least in my training, when I was learning the Feldenkrais approach, I don't know if this is really true, but I was given the impression that these were almost two opposite ways of working. Like Feldenkrais, is typically, it can take all kinds of forms, but typically a person is asked to slow down, and then maybe told, no, you don't know what I mean by slow down even more. And there's this quieting of everything to sort of bring out subtlety and also reduce any tension of effort by simply not trying so damn hard. Now, the legacy of Wilhelm Reich, I can't claim any expertise about it, but I think he's associated with what people call energy work. And I know that at least certain trainers of mine in the Feldenkrais method, so I don't know if Feldenkrais spoke to this directly, but they would sort of say, energy work can mean like if you're angry, go outside and yell, and like that's not what we do. And they sort of acted as if these are different approaches. And I think there was even a little bit of, we've got the good approach, that's the bad approach, don't do that. But you recently posted an entire book by a key figure, Loyal Naidhofer. Maybe you could say more on his background. But it was basically just a person who is well-versed in Reichian bodywork, who is speaking to trainees about how do we work with people and why do we do this. And I read it, and it was really eye-opening to me. And then I made a comment on your post, and you said, well, actually, there's these 17 different kinds of somatics that I've been involved with. I'll just mention them briefly from your note, but you know what? I might not have it in front of me. Okay, so maybe we can come back to the actual list. But you had experienced Feldenkrais, Reichian, breath work. I remember you mentioned 5 rhythms, which comes from Gabriel Roth. You mentioned in that note Adi Da. In other words, you've done all kinds of somatic exploration. And so I guess where I want to begin is, a lot of people listening to this will never have dived that deep, might not have even tried Feldenkrais, although that's why some people watch this channel. But it seems to me that this word embodiment, which for me, I don't love the word just because I think that people are directed towards a certain arena of historical lineages with that word, but I think the word itself also, it doesn't fully tell people what that is, but it's a more prominent idea these days that in addition to maybe going to school and reading a lot of books and getting really smart, maybe there's something about getting more intimate with my own body that actually is connected to wisdom. So I don't think that's a new idea to you, but I do think it's a new idea for many people these days. And since you have this broad background, I just kind of wanted to start with something like that, something like the importance of exploring the body or becoming intimate with the body, balancing out this imbalance we have historically where, a lot of people feel like brains on sticks these days. But so I'm just opening a wide door for you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and anything you'd like to bring in from those many different somatic modalities that you've been.
Yeah. I think the place for me to start talking about embodiment is that any approach or method to embodiment has its, I call it near enemy, which is the mind-made version of embodiment that would happen if you conceptually and physically adopted that practice as a framework. So let me elaborate on that. If you look at, let's say, a wild animal, it's, it's embodied. In some sense, perhaps the people who are closest to that are a typical, stereotypical person would be very close to that would be something like a farmer who has worked a long time with the earth, who knows the soil. And you can see it in their basic responsiveness to the environment. They're physically interacting with the environment where they and the environment are one. They're feeling the soil, they are bending a plant. There's no thought involved. It's completely participatory with the physicality of the environment. And then you can have An example, a stereotypical example of the near enemy would be something like, I know over at Stanford, it's very common for people who are like engineers to get into, let's say, rock climbing. And there's the approach where, something like, as an engineer, I'm going to study rock climbing, I'm going to master all these physical moves. And there's a certain mind-made physicality that is very much the mind through the body into contact with the environment. And it's it's hard to pin in words the distinction, but if you look at the farmer who might be, let's say, uh, overweight, might be creaky, might not be strong, might not be that flexible, and you look at the engineering PhD rock climber, both of these in their stereotypes, typical forms, who is appears to be in very excellent shape, you notice you can see a almost a subtle disconnection of the latter with the environment. They are manipulating the environment successfully, very successfully, not participating with the environment. So, embodiment, that's the first thing I want to pull out the distinction between participating and manipulating. And any given practice, take Feldenkrais, there may be people who are using it as a portal to participation, and people who are using it it actually becomes a method of manipulation. And to talk about Feldenkrais because you're familiar with that, I have seen folks who had teachers who had I'll call it a affect of smooth, gentle responsiveness with the environment. And what was clear there is that they had mastered a mode of interaction that was they valued as the right mode. And therefore they were participating, they were interacting or the environment in the right mode. And it has a certain sense, sort of like they talk about meditators who have the stench of enlightenment. You could be like, oh, this person's really into their meditation. They're walking around, they're giving off like I'm into meditation vibes. So embodiment, you might call that the stench of embodiment, where it's a mind-made simulacrum of embodiment, as opposed to what I would consider the real thing, which is organic contact with the body, with the environment.
Well, something eventually I'm going to want to get to, which I just sort of intuit with you, is because there's so many different practices that you've been involved in, just practically speaking, there's no way that you're keeping up all of them. And yet I imagine they all have informed you. But if we go back to this engineer rock climber, I mean, I think I believe again that this is what's becoming clearer in our culture, is that the engineer who never goes rock climbing also maybe is missing something. Like there's something in the idea of I should go rock climbing, or maybe I should do Feldenkrais or meditate, or just the recognition that so much of our lives now involve these digital interactions, that people have become very sedentary, so that there's this value in going to the body. And yet once we realize that and we act on that intention, what you're pointing to is there's different levels of actual, I guess we could say maybe depth of engagement with what can be learned.
Yes, and I want to be clear that that first level of engagement, this in some sense that long discourse was aimed at folks who are already involved in embodiment practices, because doing things mechanically and as a mind-made method can be an excellent portal on the way to participatory bodily existence, if one's completely disconnected from the body at all. But if we're talking with people who are practicing embodiment, it can be useful to point out and what's beyond, let's say, mastering an embodiment practice as a method.
Yeah. Yeah, in my experience with Feldenkrais, one of the things that was tricky both for me as I was learning and then as I began teaching also was tricky was that Feldenkrais would use the language sometimes of ideal movement. And so
Mm,
he'd say things like, ideally, when you're moving, the breath is free, or ideally, the spine is lengthening.
mm,
And he would sometimes give the example. He'd say, well, if I'm working with a person with cerebral palsy, it's like I know they're not about to demonstrate ideal human movement, but if my concept of the ideal allows me to notice all the ways that I could take them closer to that ideal,
mm,
his idea of good posture, quote unquote, was not a position of a good posture, but he would say it's the ability to move in any direction at any time without preparation or hesitation. So that if
mm,
you would work with a person and because of whatever's happening in their body, they can easily go to the right but not go to the left. It's like, well, if we can help them to figure out how to go to the left just a little more easily, this is actually a global improvement.
mhm,
But, I found that if I wasn't careful when I was teaching, I mean, I remember one person sort of said, oh, you're trying to teach us how to move perfectly. I don't like this vibe, and I thought, okay, I really have to examine how I'm talking because
mm,
um, it's interesting because I think when you get into embodiment or you have a deep meditation practice, and I certainly felt this viscerally at a certain point, or I could just refer like my first experience doing Feldenkrais. One of my thoughts was, I didn't know it was possible to feel this good.
mm,
Right? So it changed not only how I felt, but my overall concept of what I could feel.
mm.
And yet, if you go into that and then you come back to someone who hasn't had the experience, in order to report on what you found and offer it to them, it could be a tricky thing where you could go off the rails and give the wrong impressions.
Mm, mhm. So, uh, I was talking with Max Lagenkamp about working on an essay on this, and this is an interesting thing about the different roots of Western somatic practices. And we sort of came up with maybe four, five roots of which everything springs from in terms of Western practices, and each of them are like different flavors. And I don't know if I can remember all the ones off the top of my head, but Wilhelm Reich, um, uh, uh, Alexander, was it F.A. Alexander? I think that's his name, F.A. Alexander.
Alexander
Um,
technique. Yeah.
uh, I think I'm forgetting the name because I know the people. Um, I think I would say I think it's Bad and Fly or something like that. Mabel Todd is the one that I remember in that lineage of like exploration, idiokinesis and things like that. But I don't remember Mabel Todd's teacher. Mabel Todd is not the right person. It's more like the tradition of idiokinesis.
Which is
Um,
like a lot of working with imagery.
yeah, working with imagery. For example, a very basic idiokinesis would be like imagine your head's a balloon. But
Yeah.
you can get extremely particular, such as let's visualize the um, let's visualize the shoulder joint as let's say two hot dog rubber balloons that are interacting with a water fountain or something like that. You can find deeper movement by very complex visualizations and
Right.
understanding the flow of different parts. Um,
That sounds
Alec
like Eric Franklin's.
Eric Franklin from that tradition, absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, so whatever the root of Eric Franklin's tradition is, um, Moshe Feldenkrais. Um, I feel like there was one more, but I don't remember. Oh well. Anyway, those are like thing is they're different flavors.
Right. Right.
Um, and I think that every tradition tends to be really aware of the virtues of their tradition and and also compare other traditions to how it doesn't have the same virtues they have, and therefore seem lesser traditions. For example, someone who does yoga might be like, oh, those runners are so inflexible. Someone who does running might be like, oh, those yoga people, they can't even run 3 miles. So, everyone, I think it's a natural phenomenon, tends to judge other practices by the virtues of their practice. And from that, we can note two things that fundamentally, I view it as a aesthetic choice. There's no, if you ask what's right for a given person, it's an aesthetic choice. It's like not how should you be, but how do I want to, in what direction do I want to be developing? And there's no singular direction. In the end, if you participate in something you're attracted to, it'll change you in a particular way, and you will have not changed in the way that you would have done different practice. So you go to yoga and you become very flexible and you don't have endurance, or vice versa. And in the end, the limitation of time always means that we are faced with an aesthetic choice between different things to dive into and explore.
Yeah. Well, that aesthetic choice already, I think, begins to point to some of the ideas in searchless responsiveness. I know also in teaching Feldenkrais that I would often get the question, what's the right way? And this was actually something that Feldenkrais emphasized a lot, is although he would make these comments like, ideally your breath doesn't get halted, what he would also point out, if you're asking me what the right way is, then your definition is teacher approves, which is not yet what we're looking for. We're looking for you to be your own teacher and feel what you feel. And so, yeah, I think just the idea of, well, I'm drawn to this practice or I'm drawn to that practice. There's another phrase that I've come to use recently. So I just kind of want to ask this in another way. So I said something about somatic practices as opposed to reading books or something like that. But so the phrase that I've started using is wordless wisdom. And I mean that very literally, like there aren't any words happening. So I could have an insight and it takes the form of a sentence that I could speak in my head or speak out loud to you. But I might, the sort of the idea I have is even before I verbalize the insight was already there, right? It's like, I don't know, I go outside and I look at a tree and it sparks a memory, and that memory sparks something that helps me finish the project I'm working on. And it's like, that isn't actually a wordful, we might say, thing in that moment. But I'm probably going to put it into words really pretty quickly. But the other thing that I'd love to hear you talk about is just separate from the different modalities and how we approach them. Maybe this goes back to the sort of classic mind-body split that people, blame on Descartes, but just the value of working with the body, working in the realm that's not rationality, working in the realm of feeling, working in the realm of sensation. Again, you've done it many different ways, but you clearly place a value on working in that realm in a way that maybe not everyone has. So I'd love to just hear how you speak to that.
Well, there's two approaches you can make with respect to two approaches to words, which is in our everyday life, we use a lot of words that are pointers at some embodied phenomenon, like there's a door behind you, what's for lunch, hey person over there, will you turn on the burner on the stove? And the words are all related to patterns of activity. And the thing that people often note about words is they enable you to reason with sort of delinked from actually having to do everything. Like, oh, here's a sequence to make eggs, get the eggs out of the fridge, crack the eggs, get a fork from the drawer, whip them up, turn on the burner, put them in the pan, whatever, things like that. So I think due to our relatively recent in the Western world tradition of education And I think maybe it's been around a lot longer in some parts of the East, like let's say Chinese education to help you be a civil servant for 2,000 years or whatever. There are traditions. This isn't like an East versus West thing. This is like there's areas that have traditions of words where it was okay, it worked to manipulate the words without actually embodying the words. And that's the key thing I want to get at um, is embodiment of words. So you have some tacit knowledge. That's what you often probably a technical term for wordless wisdom.
Mhm.
And then um, I view that words, in their best cases, unfamiliar words, are waveguides or pointers to something that to fill in with embodiment. So meditation instructions could be like that. Like it's like the words are a scaffolding that point to three, a space of three things that must be found simultaneously. And but you can never conceptually immediately grasp what those 3 points are. It's rather through embodied experience that you can, one thing that you can check against is, I'm doing something, and is it hitting these 3 points? And that's how the words get meaning. They start out as a waveguide, as a pointer to a complex of things that must be true that must be so at the same time, but only through embodied experience, maybe over 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, does a word become something that's real. So for me, words aren't real until they're embodied. And disembodied words are bad practice because if we're talking about disembodied words, then it's just it's like, what are you talking about? You're not really. It's a free, what they call a free floating signifier. It's a pointer without pointing to anything.
I was just looking into my notes because you have this, in your book, you have different sections, and then between them, you have these parts called the interstitial. I guess transition from this section to the next or something like that. But there was a number of almost kind of aphorisms, but one of the things that I loved, here it is, you wrote, the root meaning of speech is the disposition it communicates. And this is something, I don't know if among the many practices you've been involved with, you've done anything that would be in the realm of what's known as authentic relating. But this is another one of my backgrounds is circling. If you've heard about circling, which takes the form of conversation, but it's a practice that really directs people at noticing what it's like to be in a conversation and how are you doing this. And so, of course, you and I are exchanging words, but we're exchanging tone of voice, we're exchanging rhythm. And what I love about that phrase you wrote, the root meaning is just the disposition it communicates, is I could say the same thing to you 5 times, but if I changed the tone, in other words, if I was coming from a different disposition, it would feel different to you. And I like that idea of the root meaning, because how many words in conversation do we sort of not fully process, but we get, oh, okay, I'm on this wavelength, and like, oh, they got excited, and like we notice those moments. But just to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about too, the other thing that I think about with wordless wisdom, and meditation is a very good example. I mean, just your sort of basic opening to meditation, people are given the notion that, oh, I'm trying to quiet down that voice that's talking. And, that can actually be problematic. People can get hung up on, I heard the voice for a moment, so obviously I'm a bad meditator, and it spins back in. But it does strike me that if I look at my phone all day, I read a bunch of words, I go out on the street and I see signs everywhere, there's a way that if I meditate, if we could say that however many words per minute tend to be churning through my head, if I could reduce that through the meditation, I would think my attention is freed to other things, including sensation and these nonverbal aspects of just being a body moving through the world. And that's part of the value that I'm also thinking about with different
Hmm.
kinds of somatic practices.
I'm going to give a different angle on that, a lateral angle. So, um, with like, well, you mentioned opening awareness with the subsequent meditation, because that's a meditation in a series of four meditations. Um, Thinking tends to be a very distracting activity for many people, but in the next meditation, which the it's about coming in contact, so to speak, with thinking as sensation. Like there's a thought, where is it, what's the actual feeling of this thought? It's sort of like almost if you drove by a billboard at a foreign country and you didn't didn't read the language. There's a billboard and it's over there and it's got big letters and it's got a whole feel. So some people, the words may, often be feeling like in a certain physical location, key, whatever. They things may vary in size. So, under in traditional Tibetan psychology, and then I'll do my take on it. Cognition is a sixth sense besides the traditional Western five senses. Even though, in the West, actually, now we have like, 25 different proprioceptive sensations that aren't listed in the five senses, but, whatever. Um, I take I take cognition as a sensation that is a derivative sensation, meaning there's experiential patterns happening in the primary sense channels. The ever the continuous cognition sensation continues the same way that hearing is pretty much continuous, as vision's continuous. I mean, if you close your eyes, you have an optic phenomenon. You can close your eyes and make it dark, but you'll still see, if you're sensitive to them, lots of light little phenomenon behind your eyes. So cognition is a sensation that's always exploring the patterning of the other sensations. But it's a sense channel that is actually a sense channel about some sense about the other sense channels. So when that is realized as a embodied experiential reality, two things. One is thinking does tend to be appropriate in quantity. It's less when you might expect it to be less, and more when you expect it to be more. For example, if you were a lawyer and you had a challenge of working out an argument before the court, you would expect your cognition to be working all the time, but it feels visceral. It doesn't feel like extra stuff. This is like the activity. The physical activity is to think. So, the key point that here is that thinking can be can be felt as a embodied sensation, and actually to the degree that you feel it as an embodied one feels it as an embodied sensation, it tends to take on the appropriate level of activity, which may in any given moment be more or less than someone is currently experiencing in that sort of circumstance.
Yeah, I really like that, and I do think there's a lot more nuance in what you said than the way I sort of talked about reducing the number of words per minute. Um, but there is a thing that, again, if we just talk about this sort of like phenomenon of more people are getting interested in embodied practices, I think and I love the idea of thinking as an embodied sensation,
Huh.
because that's still more of a fusion of the experience of cognition and thinking and intelligence, or even knowing the right answer on a test in school,
Hmm.
and the experience of moving my body through the world. It's like all those things are happening at the same time.
Hmm.
Feldenkrais would say we're always thinking, sensing, feeling, and doing.
Hmm.
Always happening. And again, if you go into psychology, or even like what's happening with people who talk too long to AI these days. I mean, we see that cognition can be a place where things go wrong. And potentially, I think that, coming back to the body can be a way of helping that balance. But what I love is you're talking about cognition, like the idea of the lawyer arguing the case versus, I don't know, walking in the woods. There's just going to be flows of cognition, and then different activities are going. So it's more a sense of like right fittedness. And also, I think many people could probably agree with the feeling that we don't know where these thoughts come from often. We say, oh, I had a thought today. And it's like literally it just sort of appears. But again, without sort of examining that phenomenon, maybe through meditation or other practices, I think there's a lot of people in the modern world who have the experience of my thoughts are really like, I don't know what to do with these thoughts, or this kind of.
I think the term is, ruminative, namely the thoughts are coming compulsively and unwanted, and it's in some sense it's like whatever's going on, however our society is structured, and when I say our, I definitely mean that in a very broad sense. Probably it's the whole modern world and whatever, whether it's even be the way that the modern world is arising in some very traditional cultures, that thoughts compulsively coming in an inappropriate time. By that I mean, by inappropriate, I don't mean they're inappropriately about sex or violence or race or something like that. I mean, inappropriate is like, this is a time to be with my spouse, and I'm thinking about the taxes I have to do tomorrow. There's something not fitting to the circumstances. And so because a lot of people experience a huge volume of unfitting thinking, that there does tend to be a sort of a whole discourse around reducing thinking. And the whole, that's what I want to sort of point at, is that when thinking's opened up into feeling, when it's like in some sense feeling thought feeling, then what you find out is the thinking always fits the circumstance, and however much you're thinking, it's always right there. It's not a problem. It's just like what's going on. It always feels good. It's like sometimes I think a lot, sometimes I don't think at all, but it almost never feels like a problem, because it's not that extra ruminative. It's not that inappropriate, that not fitting the circumstance. I'm thinking about my bills, and now's the time to be with my kid. I'm thinking about what someone said to me over and over again, as opposed to maybe thinking about what someone said, what that means once in a productive, fresh way that gives me insight. And then when the insight is exhausted, the thinking naturally is complete for the moment until some other thought that's a good wave arises.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll say one more thing. I mean, I mentioned practicing the Feldenkrais method, later coming into circling, which is this relational practice. Mm-hmm. They're very clear it's not therapy, but someone, might have a realization with a circler that they would do with their therapist or something mm-hmm. like that. But what was interesting for me was when I began working with Feldenkrais, and Feldenkrais was very clear, the body is the vehicle, but this isn't just about your body. This isn't just about movement. And yet, if you practice Feldenkrais all the time, you're doing stuff with your body all the time. And there's a certain context. You're usually lying on the floor. You might be with a practitioner on the table. But what I noticed is this doesn't necessarily solve problems like social anxiety. Like I might know something about how to, quote unquote, have good posture in terms of how I carry my physical body, but I still might shrink into myself because of, compulsive thinking. Or you mentioned, it's time to be with my spouse, but I'm thinking about my taxes. If I'm doing that, the mismatch could also show up as like some kind of tension in my body. I remember one of the Feldenkrais teachers I had, who was originally from Greece. He was giving a whole workshop on anatomy, and he was talking to other practitioners. And the individual practice is functional integration. And he said, the best functional integration lesson I ever received was when I got my green card. Because he let go of the anxiety of, like his status of being, but he was saying that was the best thing that ever happened for the troubles I had in my neck, or whatever the, it was like life changed. And so I stopped having that muscular pattern. Well, I don't know if you want to respond to that or.
Well, I'm curious actually. I'm familiar with Feldenkrais practices that are about I'll call it gaining freedom in the use of the ocular muscles, such as something like a very simple thing would be like developing a simple clock gaze or something like that. And I'm also familiar with that Moshe Feldenkrais was into judo, which is a relational physical activity. I'm actually curious if Feldenkrais, have you encountered the question of interactive gaze? So, there's something like eye muscles in it themselves. There's a relation to a interactive physicality, but judo, for example, pretty explicitly, they may talk a little bit about gaze in very functional manners, like, well, let's say, look at your opponent's hip bone when you do this or something like that. But is the exploration of interactive gaze something that you've seen in Feldenkrais or a Feldenkrais approach to?
So I can remember once being at a Feldenkrais conference, where we were asked to stand a certain distance from another person and then get closer and feel that. And you may also know that Feldenkrais was the beginning of the founding of the state of Israel. He was there, and he was part of streets fights between Arabs and Jews, and developed his own self-defense ideas around that. So a big question in Feldenkrais is fear. And it often is in relation to others. But in terms of what is traditionally, the thing is, an individual practitioner, I think the beautiful thing in that practice really has available to them, if they give themselves permission, all of the creativity of something like a jazz musician. And I think that Feldenkrais is definitely a practice that points beyond itself. You can learn things by doing a standard sort of Feldenkrais, they call it a lesson usually, but you can say, oh, this has other implications. So I haven't encountered many teachers who set up partner practices and things like that. Although the actual work of the practitioner with the client in a one-on-one situation, the idea in the training is I'm feeling how I connect to the ground, and through my body, how I connect to the other person. He called it a dance of the nervous systems. But that's a context where you have the trained practitioner and the untrained client, which is different than saying, can we make it a dance that any two people, could do? Later, I discovered contact improvisation. And for me, I thought, oh, this is kind of like both of the dancers are kind of acting like the practitioner, because everyone's really feeling into the other body through the points of contact. But so the simple answer to your question is that I don't think it's a lot in the method. But you also mentioned judo, and for me, one of the things that happened at a certain point is I noticed that a sort of, you could say, failure mode of the practice could be that all my attention is here on my body in the mat. But some of the practices, including with the eyes, get you to notice the room. And I'll often, when I'm working with people, I'll say, can you feel that one of the walls is closer to you? And you can just sort of feel that. But that environmental awareness, I know he had it because he was practicing judo. So anyway, there's more I could say there, but I think that's kind of, for me, what has happened, and a lot of what's in your book. Maybe we could get a little more into that. Is the thing is, life doesn't happen lying on a yoga mat on the floor. Life happens in the environment where other people are doing stuff, and it's loud, or it's quiet, or it's hilly, or it's flat, or there's a body of water, or all of this. So it's like, I think in your book you talk about set aside practices, and that's what I would say. Like, I sit on my cushion and meditate, but then you talk about engagement, like the organism environment.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Just for fun, to try to imagine what Feldenkrais interactive gaze exercises might be. Like, for example, I'm imagining you set up two mats next to each other, you have people lie on their back, and then, something like, let your head and eyes turn towards each other till you come into contact, then turn back. And I get very sensitive to when your eyes sort of lock in,
right,
and pull and separate, and explore what it means to sort of relax the automaticity. Like, there's something, this is the right time to, what happens if you hold it more as you turn the head away? What if it happens if you don't come into contact, like sort of explore this magnetic attraction between the gaze, in terms of earlier connection, later connection, just finding at a very physical, ocular level, muscular level, what does it mean to have more muscular freedom in the context of joining gazes and separating gazes. And that just just making up on the spot, like, what I might imagine to be a Feldenkrais inspired basic exercise that would free up some mechanisms in the eye.
Yeah, and I think it could free up even some mechanisms in whichever part of my anatomy I point to where I keep my social anxiety, right? It's like, because there is that electricity when we make eye contact, which, I mean, for some people maybe who had 12 siblings growing up, they're used to, but a lot of people are also isolated today. And the whole question of communication and being with the other is a difficult thing. And that's actually part of my interest. That's something I've really been thinking about a lot recently. But let me just point to, this is a kind of a attempt at a broad stroke on your book, because there's a lot of detail in there. But what I noticed throughout the book is you catalog all kinds of, let's just say, phenomena in experience, like what the philosophers would call the phenomenological experience of being alive. What does it feel like? Everything from some of what we talked about, thought and sensation. But sensation is kind of, you did in fact put thought as a form of sensation, and there's the sensations of my body. But what I was just mentioning about social anxiety, that might be something like my feeling of myself, which the self might not, it's somehow related to my physicality, but it's also different than physicality. I can have an identity. I'm a father, or I'm a Feldenkrais teacher. I could do all these things. And then you talk about how when we look out into the environment, we see stuff, but we also care about what we see, or we don't care about what we see, which is kind of part of how our eye goes over here and over there. And where you talk about the affordances, like when I see a chair, I'm also seeing a thing I can sit on. That's an affordance. And many of the practices that are in your book are kind of about, at least the way I understood it, is, can I take that experience and actually reduce it to zero? Like, I'm looking at a tree and I'm just seeing patterns of brown and green. Whereas when I call it a tree, that's a very different experience. And so you talk about all of these different kind of, or if I say I'm a father and I walk around town being the father the whole time, then I'm in this one mode. And the sense I got is for all of these different categories you were kind of talking about, well, can we melt it down to zero? Not because it's a bad thing, but because if we can, then we can make room for a different thing to appear, whether it's a different focus of attention, a different self-conception. There's many ways that we can do that, but this idea of fluidity is in the book, and I just think what's really interesting is you catalog it in so many domains. There are some practices in there. There is that idea of a set-aside practice, but I feel like this is a book really about how do I move through the world. There are mentions of practices, but you're really talking about the 24 hours a day experience of being human, and how can we work with that. So and anyway, that was my
yeah, I like that. I like that summary. You know, the from that framework, the melting down, so to speak, to or I'm going to call that the relaxation of meaning until meaning totally fades away, is more specifically so that meaning can be constantly coalescing as befits the here and now. So it's not change for the sake of change. It's not transformation for the sake of transformation. It's in some sense, making sure that meaning is actually still in contact with the world, because whatever our structures of meaning are, they tend to have their own momentum, and therefore they tend to like a bike on a mountain trail or a car going around a track. If you're, without being able to, well, actually the mountain trail is more better because you don't know what's coming up ahead. There's this constant responsive adaptation to what you actually have, because by default, the momentum, if you at any time stop being responsive, the bike will take you off the trail, probably crash you in that case. But so our structures of meaning have momentum, and like a mountain bike, if they're not sort of continually fluidized, then the meaning will, you may get lucky and have a long stretch of straight trail, but eventually the trail changes. And if the momentum is not fluid, then the pattern, whatever pattern you're patterning, will take you off trail, and you're no longer in contact with the world. You're not there. You're doing something, but it really isn't what you would want to be doing.
Mm-hmm. And the searchless aspect is that we don't want to become fixated on one, like maybe it's great to have that. What's a good example? Well, like I could have just a feeling of rightness because maybe I start taking a new dance class and I say, oh, I love this form of dancing, but it could be that I just make everything about this form of dancing. So it's even things that could be a good thing, but we kind of have these fixations, or as we sort of talked about before, we make one thing right, and then I have to always do the right thing. It seems like the searchlessness aspect is like a malleability also of possibility.
Yeah, and traditionally, this is hinted at in some such concepts as tantric poisons, where a little bit in certain areas of tantra, it's almost a discipline to do a little bit of the bad stuff, whatever the bad stuff may be, just a little touch, just to keep that flexibility in there, because you might say you never know when to benefit all beings, you might need to do X. Like, for example, one could be a non-violent vegetarian, and that could be a very good, excellent, right form of life. so the tantric question would not be you should eat meat or you should engage in violence, but rather if a moment came in which the best thing to do was to use violence to stop um, another violent person or to eat meat because you're a guest at somebody's house and you realize that you'll actually wound them deeply if you don't eat their meal. Can you, as a non-violent vegetarian, are you fluid enough to set aside that for the moment? So it's not advocating for being a certain way. It's rather advocating for that there be no single way that becomes the ultimate unfixed, immutable way of being.
Right, right. So it feels like part of what that is there's a kind of built-in warning that any field of mastery could, I mean, mastery sounds like a good thing, but there's a trap in that we could just totalize our experience as I'm so good at this one thing that I just apply it everywhere. And so another dimension is to master what I've mastered, but to be able to set it aside at any moment, if the situation calls for it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very artful thing because oftentimes what you're doing is carefully considered to be generally the right thing to do. So finding a way to make sure that it is, well, let me just take an example. We talk, rudeness. It's, it would be not very helpful to practice rudeness a lot. On the other hand, it would be not very useful to be completely incapable of rudeness at all. So the question of how to maintain the affordance of rudeness while being a fundamentally kind and graceful person's speech is always an artful matter. And that's I'm picking something that's relatively ordinary to show that that maybe people can relate to, but it's always an artful matter to question how do I keep the fluidity when the other option is actually is to the world's benefit if I can do that, but it's not to the world's benefit if I start doing that as an ongoing activity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of like there's a right proportion to everything. But I'm thinking about, I mean, so the situation we have in the world today is feeling very tense for a lot of people. But even before sort of, let's say we got to where we're at now, I think a very common thing is we all have some particular definition of what it means to be a good person. And we could say, well, maybe that's not a bad thing to have a sort of a target that you're chasing, but that very definition can become a limitation or it can become a compulsion. Feldenkrais has
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, he would talk about that. Like I mentioned, the idea of I want the teacher's approval of what's good. And he would point out, like, I can't feel your body. You can feel your body. So if I ask you to do this movement and you feel pain, like, that's the authority, not me asking you to do the movement, even though I'm the important teacher at the head of the classroom. But then there's also what I think is so powerful about, but what you were explaining is there's also, if I have a concept of a good person, I'm going to apply it to you. I'm going to apply it to every person I meet. And then the people I meet are put into a pretty small box. And now I'm really thinking of where we're at in the culture right now, where it strikes me that what's needed is to question my own definition of something like who is a good person, just because, the way the culture is now, we've mixed so much that there's no way to assume that anyone I meet has the same starting point as me. So if I want to have a sort of an idea of being harmonious in my environment with other people, this also becomes a really key question.
Yeah, in other words, the experience of having tasted what it's like to be like the other person, uh, generates the capability to, or I don't know, generates, but it's a portal to being effective interaction with the other person. Like if the it doesn't mean that you agree with the way what the other person's doing, but it just means that like, okay, I have a taste of experientially what it's like to be that person, and uh, they're into it a lot. I'm not into it a lot, so we have something to work out here, and maybe that thing's worked out by excluding the other person or getting laws passed or whatever. But you understand this as a something like a practical approach to working out irreconcilable differences of opinions, as opposed to a moral issue in the universe that people want different things than you. It
Right.
doesn't, it's not absolutely not a call for accommodation. It lets you actually, frankly, more kindly and gently oppose people who want different things than you when there's going to have to be when it's going to have to be settled practically that which way things go.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. There's something about this isn't just I know it's not rose colored glasses, but there is something about seeing the other more fully, and something I think about a lot is, if here's one place that I like to connect my
Mm,
phenomenological or my physiological, my experience of being in a body with something that is social or whatnot, is generally speaking, to me, judgment
mm,
feels like a closing.
mm,
Curiosity feels like an opening,
mm,
right? And like I even had an experience recently with some people who are local, who the first version I got was like you and I today, was on Zoom. And then later I met them in person. And I sort of had this idea, well, they seem nice. They're kind of like this. And then when I met them, I was actually like, well, these are phenomenally cool people that I really like being around. And it was just like, it was kind of stunning to me how easily I had closed off possibility
mm.
with a surface judgment. I mean, I think that sort of happens naturally often with the first impression because you just can't learn everything about a person right away. But it also it struck me as like, well, this is something I want to have more awareness about, and what might be nicer is if I could just see a new person more as a blank slate.
Mm.
But my history, or whatever it is, I seem to have this habit of thinking I know more than I do. And that's already creating a certain like posture, I want to say, in me. Whereas I think what you're talking about in searchless responsiveness would be a more open posture. Um, I'll leave it there. There's a sort of a further question I have about this, but I wonder how that lands for you.
Well, I think this actually circles back to the question of the the distinction of participatory embodiment versus mind-made embodiment, because there's I'll call it phenomenologically made openness, and there's mind-made openness. And folks who get into, let's say Westerners who get into Buddhism, there's the disease of this was like it's particularly prominent in the 90s Buddhist literature of mind-made openness, of like a sort of forced openness, a identification of I am an open-minded person, therefore I will be open. So the I guess in this case, um, the a consideration which may hit at the more at the heart of it is the question of um, like, am I feeling this person? Um, In other words, the openness is a particularly a sensory openness to the other person at a felt sense level. And many times, especially there's like these things like openness, which are moved up the stack from sensory openness up to, let's say, I'm open to their ideas, or I'm open to these actions, where once it gets above the sensory level, it can often become sort of mind-made, because it's possible with sensory openness actually might draw quicker reaction against their activity than sensory closeness. It's sort of like, if you're immune, if you're not feeling something, maybe you won't respond against their activity as quickly.
Talking about like the classic idea of like a trigger, like a
Or
hypersensitivity or a,
numbness, or you sometimes there's the tale of the of people who are identify as open, and they facilitate uh, bad things because um, they don't want to be the sort of person to judge. They don't want to be the sort of person to interfere. They want a person to accept all others. So I think the most interesting openness to focus on is sensory openness to the other person. And what comes out of that is whatever comes out of that. And it might be labeled by observers as closedness, actually, in some cases. Namely, what are conventionally called being closed-minded can actually arise from being sensorily open. And what appears to be open-minded can arise from what appears to be arise from being sensorily close to the other person, because the person isn't seeing where it actually be very appropriate to sort of shut things down or to stop things or to disagree.
right. So there's a sense of feeling what's happening,
Yes.
but then there's also deciding how to respond, and these are two different things. I mean, obviously, would be nice to know how do we fit these two things together, but they're certainly not the same thing. There is no
Yeah.
automatically prescribed good response to any particular situation, maybe.
Yeah, and the word openness in discourse in this sort of general area, these two get well, any word gets often becomes a prescription, a imitated. I mean, the it's a classic phenomenon with spiritual teachers is that there's some students who think that the thing to do is to imitate all their outward behavior, and sometimes that is actually the point of the teacher, but the uh, the key point is that uh, there's certain words in the discourse like openness that for many people mean a set of behaviors. Like to be open would mean something like if someone served me a dish that I don't like, I would automatically eat it to be open, just to try to make an ordinary example. Or if someone suggests that you know if someone asks me how do you feel about your spouse, I would tell them to be open. So these are examples of like trying to be open as a behavioral strategy,
Right.
as opposed to the openness that we want to focus on, which is being open in the senses to the other person.
Right. And it would seem that if I just tell anyone who wants to know how I feel about my spouse, or I just eat any food, that what I'm not actually open to is my own internal sense of what I want. I've contradicted that. And so so yeah, this is really interesting. And I appreciate, the precision with language is, I think, is really important. So what I was really interested to get to, and I want to read a couple of quotes you have, but there's, at least the way I experience what's in your book is that sometimes you're giving what we could call pointers
Mm,
that involve particular uses of the attention.
mm,
And sometimes you're giving pointers that, might also relate to the body or how the
mm,
body moves through the environment. And so we could describe them in, let's say, technical terms, like you mentioned
mm.
before, the judo move where, you're looking at the guy's hip. But then if we say, why are you asking me to do these things? What I get from the book is, well, here would be a nice way to experience your life, right? And so it's not an arbitrary thing. So what I wanted to come to is, and it seems that people use many words many different ways, including this one, but you have a particular use of the word heart when you talk about the heart. And this is, but there's also something that happens when you talk about the heart that gives me a pretty specific sense of what to do with or potentially what I could do with my attention, with my body, with how I'm thinking about things. And I'll read the quotations, but essentially, well, let me start with the quotations. So one of them is, you say, the mind is in the heart, is in the unity of body and environment. So the way I'm hearing that is unity of body and environment is the heart. In other words, it's not just that thing in my chest that beats. And you're saying that like the mind is at one level and there's something larger than the mind that is the heart. And in fact, it is essentially everything around me. It's like if we're together, potentially you are part of my heart or the heart.
Mm-hmm.
If I understand that right. I'm going to let you respond. I just want to read some of the other quotations so listeners get a sense. There's another place where you describe the heart as full feeling in union with responsive action, but without a personal boundary.
Mm,
So when I read that, I'm thinking, yes, I know that my body ends at the surface of my skin, but I think Ari's asking me to downplay that boundary so that I can experience my heart. Again, that's me putting a few extra words on it, but then just the last one, as I mentioned before, you talk about care at a certain point, like how if I care about something that directs my action in a particular way, and maybe a lot of people would say, well, this is what I care about, that's what she cares about and what he cares about. But you describe care as something that's sort of environmental, that passes through us. And you said, caring arises, dissolves, and self-transforms, and we are part of that. The feeling heart is not within us. We are in the feeling heart. So if it makes sense as a question, what I'm hearing is something about a heartful way of being where maybe the way a lot of people think of themselves or of their bodies or the difference between you and me is really being, well, this is a very different conception, and that there's a reason why it would be good to, in fact, or potentially good to invite this. There are some exercises we can get to where you invite people, I think, into some of this feeling. But I'd love to just, if I summarized it hopefully pretty well, to ask you what's that all about?
Okay, so there's a number of things going on here. One is uh, the fundamental feeling of what happens. Like you have a basic, I presume, a feeling of what's going on right now. And that feeling might be described as the coloring or the shading on all your sensation. namely, some things are attractive, some things are de-emphasized, some things are set aside. And so people talk about their personal heart feelings. They get in like, I went deeply into my heart feeling and I felt what I felt about things. Um, that feeling, when you relax the personal boundary, and I'm going to get technical about that in a moment, is not, you can't really call it your feeling. Um, it's the feeling that is happening. It doesn't mean it's other people's feelings either. And here's the thing: is like right here we are. I feel what's going on. You feel what's going on. My hand is in my visual field. You're in my visual field. There's internal sensations. There's visual sensations. Um, there's sometimes it's useful to make a big distinction between what tracks well to what is conventionally called this body or me, but that's also to some degree an overlay because fundamentally there's one huge sensory experience, and you seeing me on Zoom and the feeling of maybe in your the shirt on your shoulder, these are, you call one of them my feeling of shirt and shoulder. One is like, there's Ari on Zoom, but it's all one lump. I'm all, so that feeling there, the feeling is all pervasive through experience. You have a feeling that's all pervasive experience. And this feeling can be stepped down to my feeling, but you relax it and it just becomes the feeling of what happens. Now, that feeling of what happens is that's the essence of the feeling of care. Um, like whatever is care is feeling that's moving towards something, away from something, just relating to things. And mind arises on top of that layer of care. Thinking, stuff like that, that is coming from a foundation of that felt sense of care. It can influence the felt sense of care too, but I think it's useful to be clear that my thinking arises out of my care. So the mind is in the heart, not my heart, the heart. And the heart is the complete felt sense as a whole of body and environment collectively. So that was a spontaneous elaboration from that position.
Yeah, no, this is, I mean, because this is the heart of the heart of why I wanted to speak to you, because this strikes me as so important. And at the same time, for someone who hasn't lived the kind of life where they would even maybe find your book and open to see what's on the first page, I don't know that they would encounter this idea. And I certainly wouldn't mean to reduce it to anything technical. I mean, what I would say is, it also reminds me of, let's say, others set aside practices I've done that produce certain feelings, but they are feelings that I would associate with me having more joy in my life, right? And not having to work as hard. There's a sense that if I walk outside onto the street and there's cars driving around and, there's birds singing and there's a lot going on. And for me to think that walking down the street is something that I just do with my body is one way, but another way is to say that the environment has all this momentum in it. I'm part of this whole experience of what's happening on the street. And yeah, maybe my thought or my care is that I want to go over to that store. And so but there's something that's alive there. And then if we sort of use the crude example, I pick up my phone and I do this, it's like the world gets narrowed down. And I think maybe a really accessible idea for a lot of people would be like, I look at my child and it kind of feels like that's me, that's another version of me, but really it's like, that's me, because we're both in this, you use the phrase somewhere in your book, the Umwelt, or like this big blob of all that is happening. A phrase I like to use is the musicality of being. I like to think it's like one big piece of music, but again, if you and I were walking down the street and talking, and then a ambulance goes by, like, without thinking about it, we're going to pause our conversation. We're going to flow with the environment in that way. But it seems to me, and so you wrote this book and you describe it, and there are exercises. You're very clear of sort of saying, this is what I do, and you don't tell anyone you should do this, but it seems that you're offering this as potentially, this could be a way that you might experience your life a lot more.
Let's talk about the musicality of being as an analogy.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was listening to jazz. I like jazz music, and I was noticing recently a distinction between great solo players who, when put in a ensemble context, seem to fundamentally still be in the disposition of a solo player, slightly modified by the ensemble relationship, versus those jazz players who seem to be completely at one with the ensemble. And I will, actually name names here. You may not be familiar with them, but Sonny Rollins is an example of someone who I felt is like, oh, this guy is merged with the ensemble. Now, notice as an individual, you can say, oh, that's Sonny's saxophone playing, but at the same time, it is completely interwoven with responsiveness to the ensemble. It's always perfectly appropriate to what other people are doing. It's interactive, it's unique and individualistic, but it's also completely collective. And an example of someone who I must emphasize, I absolutely adore his solo music, and I also really like much of his ensemble stuff, but I was getting a different feeling with, is Keith Jarrett. I was listening to Keith Jarrett and said, you know what? Honestly, I love Keith Jarrett's music, and when he's playing an ensemble, there's a subtle feeling to me that it's Keith Jarrett playing with an ensemble, not like just a completely interactive weave there. So and again, it's good. It's interesting to note that his music is amazing. His solo music, especially, is amazingly beautiful and wonderful, and some of his ensemble music is amazingly beautiful and wonderful. But the analogy in this context is the possibility of Sonny being a Sonny Rollins. And again, that's almost why I have to say it's aesthetic, because if I had to say, is Keith Jarrett or Sonny Rollins a better jazz, I'd be like, don't ask me that. That's a stupid question. It's like they're two different aesthetics. I'm not going to like put one above the other. But this is a more exploration of the Sonny Rollins musicality of being than the Keith Jarrett musicality of being. And I would totally understand those who'd be like, well, I'd rather do the Keith Jarrett musicality of being, which would be about being a incredibly vibrant solo individual master who does participate with other people, but it's very much coming from a sort of individual mastery point of view.
Right. And I suppose we could say that if you're Keith Jarrett, you potentially are well aware that you're doing that, and you might just decide, I'm foregrounding myself because that is my choice to be the soloist. But when I think of it in terms of just life interaction, I guess what I'm thinking is something like a seamlessness, maybe even a blueprint for, how could we live on the earth without destroying it? that kind of thing. But it's this sense of, if I go back to attention, and this is something that I've played with, and maybe I couldn't even get to some of the exercises that are in your book, but there's this sense of like I'm over here, you're over there, but there's also a conversation, which is almost like an organism that we're participating in. Like, can I pay attention to this conversation? And can I even, as I do that, notice that my laptop is sitting on the table in my kitchen, and there's that part of the kitchen, and down below the window that there are cars driving by, and that all of this is kind of, I mean, I might want to center my attention somewhere, but I mean, I don't know if you would agree with this. It kind of feels like an intuition, but what I often find myself doing is, if I'm talking to you on Zoom and your Zoom square becomes the entire world, and I notice that there's more world, I go, oh, let me include the rest of the world again. And it seems to kind of feel better. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, though, I am in this meeting, in this conversation, have gotten more and more into a different space, which is the space of being you. And let me see if I can describe that in a way that connects for people. Perhaps you could, if you are playing a video game, Mario Brothers, whatever, anything. I don't remember Pac-Man. I don't necessarily know, but I think it's even truer for more recent things. You can become the character. You're automatically moving, let's say, Pac-Man, right, left, up, down. So as I, you might say, identify physically and viscerally identify more and more with you, it's interesting. It's the field of conversation becomes experientially more co-equal to me. Like, it becomes one field because when you're speaking, I'm speaking.
Right.
Even though I know, like right now, I find out what I'm saying at the same time I say it. When you speak, I find out what I'm saying at the same time I say it. Both cases, I don't know what I'm going to say until I actually hear it spoken out. So that's the actual space I'm in right now.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I can feel that. And there's something about you naming it out loud that also creates a little feeling. There was also a moment when I read all the quotations about the heart where there was a shift that I felt, partly just our rhythm slowed down. There was a little more, but yeah, I think there's a thing there that, thing is the worst abstract word when we don't know what word to use, but a thing in the sense of there's something to feel. There's something like you were using, forget the phrase, the sensory field, I think but when we were talking about openness, you talked about sensory openness. So there's, maybe that's what I want to say is, we can have a sensory openness to another person that I think, again, growing up in this culture, one might not realize that we can have. And maybe you need to actually have the experience a few times, maybe by chance or because of a particular individual who has a particular, it could be, I don't know, maybe a spontaneous thing. I don't think it's what's happening with you and I in this moment, but like when people experience falling in love, like something, there's a weird, energetic, physical, I don't know what it is, but there's something going on here kind of thing that happens. But I think that's potentially always available, whether or not romance is the context, there's that thing. And I often think of that too. Like, I know that's Ari, but in a sense, if I think that's me, the way I experience you changes quite a bit. Yeah, I'll see if you want to respond to that.
No, that was well expressed. I don't have anything.
Cool. Well, it's funny. I remember there was a piece of your conversation with Artem Zem where you guys were talking about what happens when you have an agenda. And so there's something that we're talking about that I'm feeling that's really cool. And then there's a bunch of notes below me, which is like the agenda. But I mean, the part of my agenda was to come to this place. And then what I thought would be cool to mention, because I think it's still related to, like, if anyone watching is like, what the hell are they talking about? And then maybe these exercises would open it up. But you have, so again, the book is Searchless Responsiveness, and you have the simplest exercise of searchlessness and the simplest exercise of responsiveness. And I mean, I could summarize what I got, or if you like,
How long are they? It seems like you could read them. They're not that long, right?
Yeah, I mean, their whole page. I have just a sort of a brief description.
Oh, go ahead and summarize it.
Yeah. So with searchlessness, you talk about. So this does take a little setup. You talk about doing a triple release. In other words, there are 3 things to release. And it reminds me of a particular Buddhist meditation practice where you're meditating and you notice, do I have any blissful experiences? Oh, and do I also notice that I really want those blissful experiences to keep going and going? Like, in other words, am I clinging to them? Or do I feel discomfort? Maybe my back hurts. Do I just want it to go away? Am I, trying to push it away? Or maybe a third thing is like, I'm just bored right now and I want a different experience. So you gesture to those 3 things that we do, that we sort of try to cling to something, we try to get away from it, or we just try to replace it with something different. And what you talk about is letting go of all of that. So that it might be, for example, I do maybe have some physical pain and the pain continues, but I let go of the part where I'm like, why do I have to have this pain? This is so terrible. And so what the phrase that I wrote down in my notes is you say, the first exercise of searchlessness is the relaxation of the essential essence of doing. It's like there's the experience, there's the thing that you just were saying, it's what's happening. But then maybe this even goes to what you talked about with the rock climbing. It's like I'm trying to manipulate what's happening rather than just having the experience of what's happening. I don't know if that works well for a description of an exercise. So if you want to say more, but that's kind of how I had summarized it.
That works well enough. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the exact wording I used. So, but that sounds good. Is this the same exercise as sitting in a room and wait, watch, and see what happens, or is that a different exercise? I don't remember.
That's something that you called another simplest exercise.
Oh, that's the other simplest exercise.
That's worth mentioning. I mean, so what's interesting here is the one I just mentioned, maybe if it sounds a little like confusing, the distinction I would make is it's not a set-aside practice. So you have this set-aside practice where essentially you say, sit down and don't do anything, and continue to not to just think that you're not doing anything, but notice if at a certain point you find yourself doing something. But it's, in other words, you don't sit there and plan, what would I like to do? Okay, I'll go do it. But it's like a way of inviting something to arise.
Yes, until you do something that is not motivated.
Right.
It's not for the sake of anything else except the action.
Yeah.
Action arises.
And that might be an easier place to start, because in the sense that I think you even say set a timer, right? Like you might set a timer for 10 minutes. I'm going to try not doing anything for 10 minutes. And what I might just discover is, like, if I have this idea that I'm only a good person if I am productive, that it's stressful for me to do nothing for 10 minutes, and I want to go check my email and I want to do these things. But
But to be clear, in that exercise, for anyone who's like trying to do it, it's not a exercise of sitting still. It's an exercise of sitting still until
right.
some activity arises without motivation, which might be, um, I feel like drawing. I feel like drawing cartoon characters, or I feel like looking at my backyard. But the thing to be sensitive to is if there's any secondary motivation, it's like for the sake of. You're waiting for activities that occur without any for the sake of, except in the sense of they're for their own sake. They're self-justifying activities.
Right, right. In the sense that I got was that if I can also stop sort of taking this present moment experience and saying it's wrong in all the following ways, so I'm going to do things to correct the wrongness of my present moment experience. In other words, that thing about adding to it or taking away or changing it,
Yeah.
that would be essentially if not exactly the same, but a similar idea as the one where I sit and wait. But the thing is, it's not a set aside practice. I might be walking down the street and do that release. I might be having this conversation with you and realize that I'm trying too hard to get Ari to say the thing I want him to talk about, and then I might let go of that compulsion that I had or something like that. So I got the sense that one was a practice, for a beginner to understand, do this, but then the other practice is kind of like, do this at any moment in life. And it would potentially bring you closer to this state of searchlessness.
Yeah. And it's not, I want to distinguish it clearly from quietism. To give up, you could both give up manipulation, yet increase participation. And so that means, in some sense, you might, to put it in very ordinary language, it's, the continual, here we are, I totally accept it. And, but what shall I do now? At a basic phenomenological level. So it's fully participating, but always taking what is as the start, as the start of the scene, so to speak.
Right. Something that came into my mind is like I'm walking down by the lake on a beautiful day, and I go out on the dock, and then I just decide to strip off my clothes and jump in the water, even though I didn't bring my swimming suit, because that's what actually wants to happen. And of course, I might have reasonable ideas in my head that would prevent me from doing that. But if I can kind of let go and just realize, I feel almost just called to dive in, and I do it.
Yeah, you check, are the cops around? Then you actually, I don't know what DC laws are, because I think California's laws are technically, they're saying like oftentimes they're nude, not lewd. Like I think a lot of parts of California, non-lewd nudity is technically legal, though, not everyone knows that.
Right,
Of course, ludity, I don't know if that's a real word. Ludity is can often be can often be an open question in some circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, you could also maybe have that feeling and then look at, there's little kids around or something, and it would feel natural that I don't act on an impulse.
Absolutely.
It would also not be like, oh, damn it, I can't do what I want. It's like the signal that there's children around is a signal from the environment. Like maybe I'm still in that sense of the mind within the heart, and part of the heart is the
it includes the totality. Totality, the totality includes both the deliciousness of feeling the beautiful water on your whole body, every inch of it, and also the consideration of how children or their parents may not find that a enjoyable thing, and it becomes a whole gestalt, which yields the subsequent action.
Right. And then so I guess what kind of comes through in this example is whether to jump in the water or not isn't really my decision in a sense.
Yeah.
It's given to me, but also I think what you're getting at in the book is that that's a beautiful way to be.
Yeah, it
Because
is sort of given to you like the total environment very often it's interesting because the total environment often has is sort of calling for certain actions. When I say the total body plus environment is often calling for certain actions. So it's sort of hard to say that you're really your own. It's like, sometimes it's really obvious, such as you know, someone spills something and the it's calling you and like the body just leaps up and goes and starts helping them pick it up. It's like, did you choose, from this when you're in this space, you don't really choose to go pick it up, nor do you do it as an obligation. It's rather it's like, this is what the circumstance seems to naturally call for and therefore move you to do.
right, right. So we could probably say more on that, but just to get to the next thing. So that was, we were talking about searchlessness, and then you have an exercise for responsiveness, which actually I feel like we're starting to get to it already, and it relates to this idea of the heart as the totality. But in the simplest exercise of responsiveness, again, this isn't the whole exercise, but I took a note. But one of the key things you say is you're looking to erase the distinction between the quote self and the circumstance. And you
Hmm.
also use the phrase, you become the interaction.
Yes. Yeah. Are you looking for commentary here?
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, I mean, I feel like we were just talking about that,
Yeah,
but
exactly. It's like, yeah, there's I think it might be useful to actually to clarify I talk more about this, what I mean by the self. The self is I consider that the self when you're in the field of feeling, the self is a pointer, or technically speaking, a dexical, like Washington, D.C. If you look at Washington, D.C., 200 years ago, then it's a very different, actually, you'd have to scour through things, say what changed, what stayed the same. You're pointing at a place that is in every moment different and changing. Now, so the fact that there's no what's called self-identity, meaning Washington D.C. in this moment is not exactly identical to Washington D.C. 1 second later. The fact that these things are not self-identical does not mean you can't legitimately point and say Washington D.C. Or even more clear, you could say here. Here is wherever you are right now, and it changes all the time. Now is different all the time. Self is a pointer towards something very similar to here and now. It's something like the gestalt of experiencing right now. And that is a real thing. You can say like, I feel like tomatoes. I feel like eating tomatoes. There's, yeah, of course, that's pointing to something that's happening here and now, that feeling. But it so when the fixed self, when you understand it as just a here and now, then when the fixed self is not supported or kept, a self remains as a completely, it's almost like part of the environment. It's just like part of the totality. Right now, the self is craving tomatoes. Right now, the self is tired. These are all true, and they're not that much different in informative content than uh, I'm at a computer. It's all good stuff. It's all, things that are happening right here and now. Um, but there's nothing that's special about the self versus the environment or vice versa. They're all just, part of the totality of experiencing.
Yeah, so well, as for my agenda, there's one more thing on it, and you actually set it up pretty well because there's one more exercise in your book which relates specifically to self or the experience of the self. But I think it's again, I'll just use my own impressions, but I think it's something like how to move from the way we might typically think of ourselves in this
Mm.
culture to this broader totality of the environment self that we've been talking about here. And I really like, I just want to tell you personally that this blew me away. And I've played with this a lot. I found it difficult at first, but the more that I play with it, even the glimmers of what happened for me was really cool. And so it's
Mm.
called, the exercise is called the clarification of self via inversion of the skies.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Should I say more of mine, or do you want to maybe take it
Oh,
from?
let's hear. No, I definitely want to hear.
Yeah.
Definitely want to hear yours.
Well, so you point to something that's pretty common is that we think of having an inner experience and an outer experience. So I see you over there. I think you put most of the outer experience with your just the basic five senses that we're used to talking about. So even though maybe food is in my mouth, even maybe the taste of the food is kind of like extra because it comes from the world and it's like I see colors. And then there's my inner experience, like I'm just looking at you, but you don't know what I'm thinking because my thoughts are internal, or it's like
Hmm.
a private experience that I'm having with myself on the inside.
Hmm.
And so essentially the exercise is called inversion of the skies. And I mean there's more to explain, but essentially what you say is can you treat the inside world like the outside world, and can you treat the outside world like the inside world, which is easier said than done, right? I found that like even if I got the concept, it's almost as if when I look over and see Ari, that's an inner experience.
Hmm.
What might be a little cognitive dissonance in doing the exercise is that you're out there beyond the surface of my skin. So it really does seem like my senses are reporting to me that you're on the outside. But like another thing you say as well, so the a context I've done this before. I think maybe the first time I was playing with this, I might have been walking in the park,
Mm.
walking down a trail, and there's trees and there's a lot of nature and it's just me. And then as I'm walking along, I think, oh, look at that tree.
Mm.
Then when I'm trying to do the exercise, I think that phrase, look at that tree, think of that as not yours or you, Seth. I think of that not as being my thought, but it's as if a bird had flown by, but it was actually my thought that flew by. But then if a bird flies by, the thought was more like something like, oh, that's me.
Mm.
Or if I see the tree, it's like, that's me. Or if I even see the tree and its strength and solidity like gives me a certain feeling,
Mm.
that feeling is me, as opposed to what I might typically say, like, oh, look at that tree over there. Oh,
Mm.
it looks really solid, but it's still like a observer of the solidness of the tree or something.
Mm.
Anyway, I mean, part of why I wanted to ask you the question was because I played with the exercise and sometimes, I was like, how do I do this anyway? But the basic concept I loved, and then there were these moments that might have even lasted for 2 seconds, but I felt something really
Mm.
different come through just by
Mm.
maybe not understanding why or how to do this, but as I kept coming back to it, it really shifted something. And and there is something about how, because I've asked you before about relationality between people, and there's a particular thing you wrote about that. But let me just ask you to maybe reflect on that, or say anything more you want about the.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to do another summary of it.
Yeah.
So to clarify the outer sky and the inner sky, the in this case, the outer sky would be all sensation. And so, in that case, we would include proprioception. You might say that from a sort of certain classic, a certain classic, Vedic sense in Hinduism, like am I, am I What I see, no, I am not what I see. Am I what I hear? No, I'm not what I hear. And that would get down to, um, am I inner? Am I like the feeling of weight in my joints? No. So that would include proprioception. Uh, so outer in this case would mean all sensation, whether apparently physically inside the skin of the body or not. Um, and the inner sky is all the meaning, in a simple way of putting it, it's all the meaning that's made of the sensation. What does it mean that you are in front of me? What does it mean that the tree is here? What does it mean that my belly is hungry? The sensation of hunger is occurring. All this meaning. So in Inversion of Skies, you identify as sensation and allow, I don't know what the opposite of identification is. It's allow the meaning to arise as the landscape, as the environment. And this can be a portal to seeing how that this separation is artificial to some degree. They sort of starting to let them blend, meaning and sensation are all one thing. And that, it's like if I look at a tree and think it's solid, the whole question of I and solid, or let me use a feeling word. If I look at the tree and feel that it makes me feel inspired, I, inspiration, tree, you could look at them as all things that are occurring in the environment. Or you could look at I, inspired, and tree as all things that are occurring internally. And it's having these two things yields the explosion of the inside and the outside, where I, inspired, and tree are all what's happening in the gestalt, in the heart, which brings on a new way of seeing things.
Yeah, I got the sense that the inversion wasn't so much like, hey, let's turn it upside down, but it's more like saying we typically have it all to one side, so let's go all the way to the other side, and it's almost like a canceling out of the inside and outside.
Yes, or not a cancel. Yes, it is. I would the word canceling out. That's not a bad turn of phrase. It's the yeah. It's about popping the skin of the inside and outside. So it's like here's a bubble of sense. Like me that, and you're like stretching the bubble to invert, sort of turning the well. I guess you could do this in four-dimensional space. You're turning the bubble inside out.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is a almost a way of stretching the bubble. So when you let it go, it just pops. The whole inside outside distinction pops.
Right, because I think you describe at one point that the self is literally what divides the two skies. The self is that divides the two skies. So so then if we can pop the division, then the environment and what I call Seth, they become the same thing.
And the self is still there, but funnily enough, the self is, it's no longer a dividing film, a dividing membrane. It's there's some sort of self that's integrated with the neither inner nor outer. This is language is very hard to
Right.
but it's not, the vanishing of the self as membrane leaves a self as phenomenon, something like that. I don't know. This is hard to express in words, but I'm grateful that to try to improve it.
Yeah, I mean, I told you before, I talk about wordless wisdom, and I write about, but this is to circle back to that. I mean, now that we're talking about the inversion of the skies, I assume that the care that you feel is what made you take the time to struggle to find the words to help another person access this experience, right? And this is an experience that, yes, we're trading words right now to try to flesh out what it is so that people could have an idea. And I mean, I'm personally trying to understand it better for myself. But as I said, when I tried to do something along the lines of what the words seemed to be pointing to, I did feel that new experience was being opened up to me. And I mean, I tie this into those definitions of the heart that we already talked about. So, because a person could say, oh, that's beautiful that the heart is the totality of the environment, but it doesn't feel like that to me. And so I actually did have the sense with this exercise that it starts to make it feel that way a little more. And it's like, if I pass someone on the street and they look upset, and they're a stranger, I mean, I might judge that it's not my place to go and like talk to them, but I might feel, wow, that person's hurting right now. And I mean, we could just call that empathy, but it also feels like I'm actually picking up more of the signal of the environment. My perception feels brighter or clearer. There's more, I just feel more connected.
Yeah, it actually, I think for me, there is a practical sign of capability of intervening positively in more circumstances, and that might be simply as well. Let's just take something like I said to somebody the other day, "You have a nice smile," and it wasn't a lady, and I'm a straight guy, but but the feeling of the feeling in my heart communicated that it was a purely positive comment, and it was a purely positive appreciation, and I think I could see him glow.
Yeah.
And it's just just feeling, oh, this is a beautiful moment for that to flow, and it just it just flows. Then you find it almost actually I wouldn't say feeling this is a beautiful moment to flows, rather it flows, and then you observe what happens spontaneously, like there's no pre or forethought, like it spontaneously flows without any thought. It would be nice to compliment. Rather, the compliment flows. And you're
Yeah.
like, huh, look at that compliment that occurred. Out
Right.
of
You just notice yourself
this
saying
body.
this.
Not really mine. It's not really mine. It just happened.
Right. And I think embedded in that story, the point where you say it wasn't a lady and I'm a straight guy, that also doesn't stop you from
Yeah.
saying it. Whereas for a lot of people, there might be a guy who sees a straight guy and he sees another guy has a nice smile, but he's damned if he's going to say that. And that would be, I would say, I mean, actually, there's no moral judgment there, but I would
Yeah.
say he has less freedom of
That's
movement
right.
in,
Yeah.
in his overall experience.
And his less capability to benefit the totality due to I'm going to, it's funny. It's a funny phrase because you can use self-imposed limitations, but by that you could almost mean that limitations imposed by the presence of the membrane of the self. So it's not like I'm so in this sense of self-imposed has an interesting esoteric reading where the membrane the optional membrane of self imposes a limitation as opposed to the sort of conventional reading of I'm having a thought and I'm stopping myself. No, it's like the whole membrane of the self the membrane of the self in itself provides a limitation on responsiveness.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is what I was saying is like, on the one hand, if we try to catalog, I mean, just the work it took maybe to hopefully someone got a sense of what the inversion of the skies is, but there's a lot of sort of technical, well, I mean this and I don't mean that you
Yeah.
have to do, and it's technical in the sense of this is precisely how I am indicating to use your attention and what things to put here and what to put there. But again, this result is like, I love that story you just told. And I mean, if we think of love making or music making, those are ensemble activities where this membrane of the self actually diminishes the quality of the overall experience that we're all having together. And what I think you're saying is like that could just be a way of being, whether you're making music, making love, or just walking down the street. This is an option that we could be looking for at all times.
Mm. It's interesting because there is a conventional, I would say not conventional, traditional analogy, or there's a, I don't know, there's a certain meditation which is something like treat all phenomenal reality as the as a lover.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's like, like whatever I do with my lover, what it means to make love wonderfully, um, what does it mean to well, here's a cup, to have that same sort of relational interaction with it. So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I've done a meditation from this teacher. I think you're familiar with Rob Burbea, who has some
Yeah,
recordings.
what a wonderful voice Rob has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and he would teach, the classic meta loving kindness, where I might say, "May you be at peace, may you be safe, may you be protected." All these kinds of, I'm wishing you well. But
Mm,
part of what he in one of his teachings, he says, as you repeat the phrases, notice how you speak. Like, notice, are you intoning the care? Are
mm,
you just saying the words, or are you intoning it?
mm,
But then he had another meditation, which he called meta to all phenomena. And it was like,
mm,
there's a sensation in my knee. Oh, I love the sensation. Made the sensation in my knee have the best, life that a sensation in the knee can have. And there's a silliness when you hear about it, but there is a way that everything can glow, and you can kind of feel glowy about everything. And then you absolutely act differently
mm.
in the world. Yeah, so that's cool that you brought this up. Here's this little quotation that I wanted to read, which I think it still stays on the same subject, but it comes with this exercise of the clarification of self via inversion of skies. And then you said, a particularly powerful transformation of human relationality occurs when experiencing the sensation, in other words, the visual and auditory and kinesthetic phenomena, when experiencing the sensation of other people as interiority and emotional responses and thoughts about others as exteriority.
Mm.
I mean, does that speak to maybe even like clearing out projections that I might have about another person? Like, let's say I have a thought about, Ari wears that kind of t-shirt, so he must go to the gym all the time, or I don't know, like some.
Both true. I do wear this kind of t-shirt. This is my favorite color t-shirt. I do go I don't know if I go to the gym all the time, but I do go to the gym. Yeah.
Right. But that's like me making a commentary on you somehow. But then it says, if I were to experience the visual and auditory and kinesthetic phenomenon of Ari in front of me, that's like an internal feeling. And you say this is a particularly powerful transformation of human relationality.
Um, you know, it's it's about, when you identify with someone, um, that is as as you can sort of go. When you identify them viscerally, physically, that's really about as deep as you can go into um, interaction or relationship with them. But all these internal thoughts about someone else, um, this is they still arise as informative possibilities, not possibilities like we that like if you're see somebody, let's use this both positive negative. Like you see somebody on the other side of the street and you identify with them, um, and maybe the thought is, huh, they look like they might attack me. Well, you're really ready to participate. So you know you can actually feel viscerally if their emotions start moving towards you in a unwholesome manner. Um, and this, of course, works with wholesome stuff too. But so the identification, the arising of the other as the self, really is the fingertips feel, or they say in German, Fingerspitzengefühl, of the other person's interaction that lets you really interact with them in a dance. But we're still respecting the informative but not compulsory missives that things such as thoughts and opinions have.
Yeah. It's just kind of cool to me that like if I have some idea of I want to be closer to a person,
Mm,
I still might never have previously had the thought, let me imagine that I am that person.
mm,
And so that's the little thing that, I mean, maybe it's not a great word, but that's the part that I've been calling technical. I mean,
mm,
I could also imagine that it happens spontaneously, that I realize I'm identifying that person as
mm,
myself without ever reading Ari's book and doing an exercise.
mm,
But I think anyway, that's what I find so fascinating is that those two things
mm.
happen together,
Yeah.
and that there is, in fact, I mean, I'm sure we could, just like we were talking before about the rock climber, like we could misuse this exercise just like any other one.
Oh, yes.
But I think that
There's no exercise that is immune from being made into a imitative a false imitative. There's not a single thing method one in the whole world that is immune from being placed in quotes like now I am being kind, now I am meditating, now I'm feeling space. There's simply no method that escapes that
yeah,
risk.
yeah, no, and I think that's a really good addendum to put on this. But I just, to the degree that we understand how to use this kind of exercise and we actually bring it, and as I said, my experience was like the inversion of the skies. Sometimes something would seem to click, and other times I would say, well, what am I doing here? But just the fact that it can work that way to me is
Mm,
like utterly fascinating. That there's something that is I do with my attention, I do with my intention, and it's the flip of kind of like the way I've tended to think about stuff, or haven't even thought about it at all. Why would I assume that Ari is me? That's Ari. I'm me. Everyone knows that.
mm,
It seems to flip something that seems really,
mm,
really common sense, and
mm,
yet it has this incredible affordance to it. So,
mm, mm.
wherever that came from, I mean, I suppose another question I had, maybe this would be a way of wrapping up. But I appreciate that you brought that to the fore, whether it was entirely your creation
Mm.
or if it came from different backgrounds, all the different things you've studied. But that was the last thing that I sort of thought of is I can relate to. I've studied 12 different things, and I'm talking to people all the time who are like, oh yeah, I do this, and
Mm.
this, and I'm reading this book by so and so, and so there's a way of taking all the too muchness of all the experience we've had, but boiling down to principles.
Mm.
Just something I'm really appreciative of in
Mm.
your work. And so I don't know if that's a good thing to ask about, or if you would have any reflections, but it seems like it's actually a common conundrum in the world, is that we're all imbibing multiple streams of information, multiple forms of learning, and we have to boil them down in a way.
Yeah, or I might I might for analogy to the analogy of an artist who a visual artist who sees who's a typical visual artist will see immense quantities of visual art, and they also have the challenge of refining a personal aesthetic. Now, there's two ways to go about that. One is the art school way of the striver, which is the feeling that I need to have a personal aesthetic for a career or to be famous or for money, where the personal aesthetic is not a organic development, but rather a a striving to have a personal aesthetic, which honestly sometimes works out in practically pretty well for people. I mean, I remember reading I think it was Mark Kobastabi or something like that. I'm forgetting the name. I think that name. He was a guy in the late '80s who very intentionally is like, I want to be a famous artist and I want to be a rich artist. And I've done my research and here's my art approach, and then here's how I'm hiring people to do it for me. And he was relatively successful in that approach. But here in these matters, yeah, there's some of us, for whatever reason or whatever reason, are going to come upon a eventually arrive at a personal aesthetic that is their digestion of all that they've experienced, and that just enters into what one of my teachers called the eternal conversation. It's like each generation of painters, some people digest it and create something, and then that becomes the food. Cubism. I'm not really exactly sure. I have to ask an art historian where did Cubism exactly arise from, and then we know sort of and where it went to. So it came from somewhere and it went to somewhere, but it's also a personal digestion of a few artists of that era that were doing something very had found something. So we're just part of that stream. You, me, those of us who have actually digested it enough to be able to present our personal aesthetic.
Well, it's been lovely to be in the stream with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is awesome. I'm actually thinking to ask you one more question off camera when we end the recording, if you have another minute. But
Sure.
Before we do that, I just want to thank you, for this conversation, for your
It
work.
was lovely.
Again, if people want to check it out, it's Searchless Responsiveness, and you can find Ari on Substack. I think you spell your name Ari on Substack, but
Yes, I do. Yes.
here it's with the YEH. And yeah, this was just really fulfilling for me, and I've wanted to talk to you for a long time, and this was absolutely like everything I had hoped for in terms of just making the connection. There's a lot in your book and other things that I've discovered because of what you wrote about that have really opened up. So it was a real joy to be with you.
It was a joy to be with you too.
Yeah.